Panase, Nitsigas, and Karrie Auger, Wabaska Treaty 8 territory, Litsinia, but I've been living in Amiskwichi, which is in so-called Canada for pretty much most of my life, and I am a Nihiao woman.
Hi, glad that everyone could join us today. It's sort of weird not to see you all, but glad that you're listening in. My name is Nancy Van Styvendale. I'm a white settler scholar and associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies in Amiskwichi, like Karrie said, which in English we refer to as Edmonton, Alberta, in so-called Canada. My academic background is in Indigenous prison writing. And in terms of the point of why we're here today, I'm involved in coordinating a creative writing program at a number of institutions in the Prairie provinces, so both in Saskatchewan and in Alberta, at the Saskatoon Correctional Centre, Pine Grove Correctional Centre, and the Edmonton Institution. And Karrie and I both facilitate Inspired Minds, which is the name of our program, both facilitate Inspired Minds classes at the Edmonton Institution. And that program, it's so different from what both Dr. Tynes and Dr. McGloin were talking about. Our capacity is very different. The program isn't sort of entrenched within the system in the same way. Our capacity is much smaller. So it runs as a program that sort of sits in between the university and the various carceral institutions. But we do offer a certificate of completion to folks who complete the program.
And we just wanted to start today sort of similarly to how we would start a session with Inspired Minds, to give you a little taste of sort of what we do. And the first way that we start our sessions is to get a writing prompt. And we've used this book many times. It's called Richard Wagamese Embers, one of Ojibwe's meditations. And we would pick a meditation, and then we would get the men to free write on it for 5 to 7 minutes. And then we would share about it after. We're not going to share today, but I'm going to share a meditation with you. From our very first breath, we are in relationship. With that indrawn draft of air, we become joined to everything that ever was, is, and ever will be. When we exhale, we forge the relationship by virtue of the act of living. Our breath commingles with all breath, and we are a part of everything. That's the simple fact of things. We are born into a state of relationship, and our ceremonies and rituals are guides to lead us deeper into that relationship with all things. Big lesson: relationships never end, they just change. In believing that lies the freedom to carry compassion, empathy, love, kindness, and respect into and through whatever changes. We are made more by that practice.
Thanks, Karrie. So following from that prompt, which obviously talks about sort of the importance of relationality, we're going to talk today about the philosophy and the grounding of our program, first in an anti-colonial abolitionist approach. Then Karrie will talk about relational framework, and then we'll talk about how we've continued that relational framework in the time of COVID. So I'll speak first about our anti-colonial abolitionist approach to this work. So what we mean by that, by an specifically anti-colonial abolitionist perspective, is that we understand prisons to be a symptom and a function of settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, in other words, being the ongoing colonial occupation and settlement of Indigenous lands. So the same carceral logics and systems that exert oppressive control over Indigenous bodies through the prison industrial complex also operate on Indigenous lands. And prisons then are part of the systematic removal of Indigenous people from their lands, cultures, legal orders, systems of governance, languages, etc., and kin. Incarceration from this perspective is a mechanism of settler colonial warfare, and not only in the past, but today. So some people think of settler colonialism as being a historical event. We think of it as an ongoing system. And you can see that in some of the statistics that exist around Indigenous incarceration. I know that Indigenous peoples in the States are similarly overrepresented in the system. It is more stark here in the sense that the proportion of Indigenous peoples within the system is more sort of striking. So every year since 1960, Indigenous incarceration rates in Canada have increased by 1 to 3%. And between 2005 and 2015, the Indigenous federal prison population increased by more than 50%. Indigenous people make up almost 30% of the federal prison population, whereas they make up only 5% of the overall population in so-called Canada. And in some places on the prairies where we are located and in the north, Indigenous peoples comprise between 80 and 90% of the jail population, so the provincial system population. In 2018, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, who is the sort of the person that oversees corrections in Canada, referred to some prisons on the prairies as Indigenous prisons because basically those prisons are pretty much only filled with Indigenous peoples. So when we talk about anti-colonial abolition, we're not thinking of that as discrete from the larger abolitionist movement, but there are certain things on which we place an emphasis, and that includes the intersection of systemic racism and colonialism. So this means that our analysis underscores the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples as such, as peoples, as sovereign nations, so as political entities. Not simply as racialized people, but as nations or peoples. We also place an emphasis on the specific development and manifestation of carceral colonialism in our local context, and specifically for us in the context of the prairies. So we look at how the prison industrial complex functions here through specific colonial laws and policies and practices that undermine Indigenous sovereignty. That includes the development of the Northwest Mounted Police, now the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Canada's police service, as a mechanism of Indigenous removal. So the RCMP, or the Northwest Mounted Police, was originally developed to remove Indigenous peoples from their land, to clear the way for settlement. The pass system, which basically policed when Indigenous peoples could leave their reserve and had Indigenous people apply to the Indian agent to be able to leave the reserve. As well as the residential school system, or what you in the States call the boarding school system, where, at least in our context, it was mandated until the 50s that Indigenous children, that status Indian children attended the residential schools. So an anti-colonial abolitionist perspective understands all of those things on a carceral continuum. And so in our context, you often hear this idea that prisons are the new residential schools. So finally, we understand police and courts and prisons and the attendant institutions such as child welfare, family services, schools and universities, as well as resource extraction. All of those things work together to continue Indigenous genocide.
Thank you, Nancy. And so because our work comes from an anti-colonial perspective, it is also centered in recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and remembering that before the imposition of the penal system in so-called Canada, Indigenous peoples have had their own conceptions and practices of justice. Broadly speaking, for many Indigenous peoples, law can in part be understood as a way of being that recognizes the interconnectedness of all creation and the shared responsibility and obligation to be in good relations with each other. In Nihiao justice traditions, we call these concepts wahkohtowin and miowachitowin, relationality and being in good relations with our peoples other than human animals and all that lives with the land, the air, and the waters. These are not just broad concepts, although I am speaking broadly about them in this short time frame, but they are place and space specific and have tangible meanings such as mutual respect and principles of non-interference. So we move from this place in our work, seeking nothing more than a way to be in relation with our relatives, in a place that has been designed to take away this right from Indigenous peoples and all those affected by the carceral system. For inspired minds and practicing creativity in the prison, we try to embody relationality in all of our practices. It means first and foremost, we see the people on the inside as our relatives, and we have a responsibility to care for our relations. It means that we are less interested in redemption, recidivism, or forgiveness narratives, and more interested in what it means to be in good relation with our incarcerated relatives with the time, physical, and material limitations of the prison. And as relatives that share commonalities and specificity of place, we try and bring materials and conversations that center our interconnectedness and interdependence rather than our separateness. In our classes, we sit in a circle as a reminder that as relatives, we all belong and have a place in the circle. The circle also represents a sacredness, a sort of container to hold the stories that we share. We don't mark or grade anything because this is not about good or bad literary form, but rather a space where we can individually and as a collective use writing as a way to learn and grow together, although that is just an underpinning that naturally happens and not a mandated goal. We recognize that we have as much to learn from them and with them as they do from us, and that in that space, they are the experts, and it is a gift and a privilege that they share their stories with us. As Thomas King says, stories are all that we are. And if we can spend time with our relatives in this space and share story in respectful and mutual, vulnerable and open ways, then we get to embody the ways of being wahkohtowin and mi'kmaq that the prison system and colonialism endlessly try to remove from us. As abolitionists who work within the system, we grapple with the complexities of learning and being in good relation in the prison system. But we are not interested in reforming the system because Indigenous justice traditions and colonial ideas of justice can never coexist in this space. But if we can see our class as a moment of time where we choose another concept of justice, one grounded in relationality, then maybe we can imagine a world, write a world, inspire a world where we take care of each other, if even for a moment. And that moment is wahkohtowin. As I was once told, that wahkohtowin is not just about interconnectedness, it is about responsibility too. And all of our actions, as well as our inactions, have ripple effect outwards that affect all of our relations.
I feel like are we out of time?
You have about 2.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll speak quickly. I think although Karrie ended it in a way that's going to be more powerful than the way I'll end it, but I would just say in terms of continuing relationality in COVID, in March 2020, obviously in jails and prisons across Canada, we were no longer able to go inside. Prisons closed their doors to visitors and volunteers, as well as cultural support, so no elders or Indigenous liaisons were allowed. Prisoners weren't able to have in-person visits with family and friends. I suspect it's the same as it is in the States. Many people on 22 to 23-hour lockdown. So we haven't had classes, and we don't have, there doesn't exist the infrastructure or the capacity for the kinds of efforts that the other two panelists have talked about. We did, in an effort to extend care to those inside, we did start a crowd fund GoFundMe page to put together care packages for our relatives inside. And that fundraiser was inspired by the wealth of mutual aid endeavors that arose across Turtle Island or North America to assist prisoners in the early days of the pandemic. So we started with a really small goal of $250. We ultimately raised over $4,000. And that allowed us to provide care packages to over 1,200 people at 4 different institutions in the prairies. In our care kits, we call them COVID care kits, they contain soap, writing booklets, a pencil, a letter of support, and a self-care pamphlet that we put together, designed by members of Inspired Minds and Straight Up, which is another organization we work with that is for people who are looking to leave street gangs. Inside the pamphlet, we provided writing prompts, relaxation skills, and writing exercises that are similar to those that we would do in an Inspired Minds class. So that was our way of continuing our program in a small way. Based on Inspired Minds participants' past interest in inspirational quotes, we filled the back page with inspirational quotes, and we crowdsourced those on Facebook as a way of involving the larger community. So we very much see this as a project that was by the community for the community, a genuine mutual aid sort of project. In November and December, we repeated the project again, focusing the care packages on winter storytelling, and we this time invited people inside to respond to us. And I just picked up a bunch of letters last night, people who sent their writing to us. So ultimately, just in closing, the Care Package project has been one of practicing an ethics of care for those inside, beyond and in spite of state mechanisms of division and fracture. The COVID pandemic has both highlighted and exacerbated the lethal implications of carceral colonialism, but at the same time, the pandemic has created surprising opportunities for community care and connection. While it is a small gesture of support, the Care Packages project was animated by a desire to stand in solidarity with our relations inside, to care for those relationships, and to let those inside know they are not alone. Thank you.